Welcome to the Harry Bridges School of Labor, presented by Labor United Educational League. Tonight's class will be on the history of predecessor organization, Trade Union Educational League, or TUEL. The purpose of the Harry Bridges School of Labor is to educate the workers of America on the strength of unions and to foster a class-conscious workforce. We aim to connect the struggles of the past with the struggles of today to empower the labor movement to transform from their present hopeless defensive fight into an aggressive attack upon capital. We plan to empower workers with knowledge, regardless of industry or type of work, bringing all workers to a class-oriented trade union movement. Tonight, we have a very dense topic, the history of TUEL. And once again, like many other topics we've had, there is a lot we had to cut out because there's too much to fit within an hour and a half. And I recommend everybody to get a more in-depth understanding of the Trade Union Educational League. Get I would start with volume 7 with the predecessors. I believe that's in volume 7 to volume 10 of Philofona's History of the Trade Union Movement in the United States. And also volume 11 goes into the founding of the Trade Union Unity League, which we'll touch on at the end in our last section. And once again, tonight's class is on the history of TUEL, the Trade Union Educational League. And we're gonna this session is broken down into 4 sections as opposed to the usual 3. We're gonna go into the predecessors of a TUEL and its founding. Then we're gonna go talk about the first conference and the following period up until the second conference. The third section will be the second conference to the third conference of TUEL. And the last section will be the formation of the Trade Union Unity League at the fourth conference of TUEL. And with that, we'll go to section 1.
Section 1, the predecessors of TUEL and its founding. The post-World War I period of 1920 was not a period of unprecedented boon for everyone that history books portray. Rather, it was the beginning of a depression that saw hundreds of thousands of workers out of work and industries depressed. Steel, iron, and coal industries were severely depressed, and by 1921 were only operating at a third of capacity. At this time, business owners were stressing at an overproduction and being equipped to produce more goods that satisfy human wants than we can use. By 1921, the AFL estimated 3.5 million were unemployed at the start of the year, with that number increasing to 5,375,000 by the end of the year per Department of Labor numbers. Wage cuts were prevalent in this time in the major industries. Woes of women workers. By the winter of 1922, many women, young and old alike, were facing the prospect of sleeping in the parks. This also goes with the larger trend of a lot of people getting laid off, downsized, and constant wage cuts. The lady bum was becoming almost as common as the male bum himself. A year later, the promised industrial revival still had not occurred, and in the winter of 1923, another lady bum in New York City wrote, "To date, besides the writing field, we have tried for a clerical job as office assistant, bookkeeper, saleslady, file clerk, cashier, usher in a well-known restaurant, or a doctor's secretary, to say nothing of 11 other trades, and are still unemployed and down to our last nickel." Black women, like black workers in general, suffered the most during the post-war depression. When the war came to an end, the demand for black labor slackened. The nation's war industries, which had depended heavily upon cheap, unskilled black labor, were dismantled and reconverted to peacetime production, resulting in the mass discharge of black workers. As millions of white workers returned to the ranks of industrial labor from the armed forces, employers did not hesitate to replace their women workers, and the first to go were the black women. In Chicago, where thousands of black workers were unemployed, the local Chamber of Commerce wired to its southern counterparts, "Are you in need of black labor? Large surplus here." Actually, despite the demand for black labor in the South during the post-war months, Very few black workers left the industrial centers of the Midwest and Northeast to take jobs offered by Southern employers. And one of the predecessors of the TUEL tonight is the Syndicalist League of North America. This was formed by William Z. Foster in 1912. Foster, then a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, became convinced after a year's study of the syndicalist movement in France, Germany, and England that the IWW's policy of dual unionism was wrong. Returning to the United States in 1911, he pointed out that the effect of dual unionism was to isolate the militants from the mass of organized workers and to strengthen the bureaucracy's control of the old unions. Foster proposed that the IWW abandon its policy of dual unionism, adopt instead the policy of working within existing trade unions, boring from within, so successfully applied by the syndicalists in France and England, and devote itself to building a militant minority in these unions in order to revolutionize them. After a lengthy debate, Foster's program was rejected by the IWW. By July 1912, such syndicalist leagues of North America were in existence in Kansas City, St. Louis, Omaha, Chicago, Minneapolis, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, Tacoma, Denver, plus a number of other Midwestern and Western cities, and cities Nelson and Vancouver in British Columbia. The national organization was formed early in September 1912 without the benefit of a national convention, since it was agreed that the new movement was too weak to be able to afford such a gathering. Instead, by agreement among the already existing leagues, the Chicago Syndicalist League acted as the national conference. It drew up a constitution, selected an executive board, and elected Foster as National Secretary of the Syndicalist League of North America. Special stress was placed on the need to unorganize the unskilled. By ignoring them, the skilled workers were committing a fatal error. For 9 times out of 10, these very workers who are scorned by the Skilled Workers Union scab it out of business when it goes on strike. The immediate objective of the Syndicalist League was to build a base of militant union members in the existing unions and also to propagate the principles of militant trade unionism among the unorganized workers. It was the duty of syndicalists to contact these men and women in the union who had been fighting for militant unionism but had become discouraged, and, together with them, conduct an educational program for militant unionism. Leaflets were to be distributed throughout industry, urging unorganized workers to join the union. Many unions had only 20% of their trades organized and were not making any effort to reach the other 80%. On the contrary, they actually placed obstacles in the way through exorbitant initiation fees and highly monthly dues. It was the duty of the syndicalists to combat these practices and to convince the rank and file that until their entire trade was organized, they could not really improve their conditions. And so the second group that Foster had formed was the International Trade Union Educational League, or the ITUEL. The ITUEL was born just a few months after the outbreak of the First World War in Europe, so around late 1914. Foster argued that the delegates should not take side in the European conflict, adding that it was inevitable that the United States would enter the war. Therefore, Unionists should not have any illusions that they could prevent it. Instead, radicals within the Union should focus their main attention upon preparing to take advantage of war conditions to organize the workers and raise bigger and bigger demands. The theme that the isolated action of pure and simple craft unionism must be succeeded by a much more united and concerted action was developed further in documents issued by 2 branches of the ITUEL, the Railway Workers Educational League and the Printing Workers Educational League of Seattle. In a manifesto issued in April 1915, ITUEL announced that its purpose was to place the labor movement upon a more extended, aggressive, and effective basis. It asserted, "The need for a broader, more militant unionism than that of the present trade unions has long been recognized by progressive unionists. They have understood that if the workers are to cope successfully with their industrial masters, the isolated action of pure and simple craft unionism must be succeeded by a much more united and concerted action. In the progressive development of the present trade union lies the hope of the American working class, for we call attention, on one hand, to the complete failure of all attempts to establish a more effective unionism by means of ideal dual industrial unions, and, on the other hand, to the continued growth and development of the trade unions. Later, Foster was to concede that this theory of the spontaneous revolutionary character of trade unionism was, like syndicalism in general, a gross overestimation of the power of trade unionism and an equally great underestimation of the power of the capitalist state. In fact, Foster declared that his theory had in it the traces of Bernsteinism, which erroneously concludes that trade unions can permanently improve the workers' conditions under capitalism. Riding the rails on a 7,000-mile tour throughout the West, Foster made a valiant effort to build the new league, but failed. A few local militants tried to set up branches of the ITUEL, but their efforts were stillborn. The organization had even fewer divisions than the Syndicalist League of North America. In the end, ITUEL was represented mainly by the local league in Chicago. Several years after the steel strike of 1919, William Z. Foster noted that the defeat of the strike was a tremendous disaster, not only because it destroyed the steel unions, but because it thwarted a much greater plan. The defeat of the steel strike did not, however, diminish Foster's confidence in the correctness of the boring within policy or in the need for an organized, militant left-wing minority. Even though there was at the time no chance of obtaining any cooperation from Gompers or other top leaders of the AFL, Foster set out to establish a functioning militant minority. For several months, he worked as the business manager of New Majority, the official organ of the Chicago Federation of Labor. He left in November 1920 to form a new organization with 24 other members, all in Chicago. It was called the Trade Union Educational League. This was the third league formed by Foster to carry out the policies of working for change from within the AFL and the Railroad Brotherhoods. The first set of guidelines limited membership in the TUL to members of trade unions in good standing, divided the organization into sections according to industry rather than craft, and affirmed that the league is purely an educational body, not a trade union. Foster carefully outlined a suggested order of business for the initial meetings of the local groups and made it clear that their most important function would be the circulation of the forthcoming Labor Herald. A propaganda campaign for the amalgamation of the 16 railroad craft unions would be the first concrete steps of the local leagues, with the aim of influencing the convention of the AFL Railway Employees Department in April. The secretary of the Railroad Amalgamation Committee was Otto Wangenin of St. Paul, a prominent Minnesota farmer laborite who had been a member of the Socialist Party until 1917. The first TUEL circular said nothing about political activities. Indeed, Foster specified that TUEL meetings should not be confined to members of any one political party. To do so would be to condemn the new movement to sectarianism and powerlessness. The TUEL barely got off the ground after its birth. For over a year, Foster noted later, this body lingered along, more dead than alive, due as usual to the dualistic attitude of the radical element. Both the Communist and Communist Labor parties, which were two separate parties at this point, founded in 1919, were committed to dual unionism and opposed, and even ridiculed, Foster's aim of attempting to build an effective and militant union movement within the AFL and the Railroad Brotherhoods. In short, Foster wrote that the infant TUEL seemed fated to join its luckless predecessors. Two events in 1920 to 21 had significant influence on and altered prospects for the TUEL. In June 1920, V.I. Lenin's classic work, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, was published in Russia. It was simultaneously issued in English and appeared in January 1921 in the United States. Chapter 4 was titled, Should Revolutionaries Work in Reactionary Trade Unions? Lenin's answer to this question was a devastating blow to the advocates of dual unionism. He wrote, to refuse to work in the reactionary trade unions means leaving the masses under the influence of reactionary leaders, agents of the bourgeoisie, labor aristocrats, or bourgeoisified workers. Every sacrifice must be made. The greatest obstacles must be overcome in order to carry on agitation and propaganda systematically, stubbornly, insistently, and patiently, precisely in all those institutions, societies, and associations to which proletarian or semi-proletarian masses belong, however ultra-reactionary they may be. And the trade unions and workers' cooperatives, the latter, at least sometimes, are precisely the organizations in which the masses are to be found. Lenin criticized those who thought it necessary to leave the trade unions, to refuse to work in them, to create new fantastic forms of labor organizations. He condemned all attempts to create an absolutely brand new, immaculate workers' union, and pointed out the fallacy of progressives leaving the established mass membership unions to form revolutionary new unions with insignificant memberships. Among the organizations he singled out for criticism was the IWW for playing into the hands of reactionary leaders who were only too happy to be rid of progressive opponents. Lenin also hit hard at the boycott of political elections and the underestimation of the importance of struggles for immediate demands. The other important event of 1920-21 was the founding in July 21 of the Red International of Labor Unions, known by the Russian abbreviation for it, Profitern. The U.S. delegation to the first Congress of the Profitern in Moscow included Earl Browder, the Kansas City, Missouri syndicalist, who had become a member of the Communist Party in January 1921, and Mother Ella Reeve Bloor. Foster went along as an observer, also serving as a correspondent for the Federated Press, a labor news service, to which he sent articles dealing with life in the Soviet Union. Foster was particularly pleased to see the following statement adopted by the Profitern. The question of creating revolutionary cells and groups within the American Federation of Labor and its independent unions is of vital importance. There is no other way by which one could gain the working mass in America than by leading a systematic struggle in the trade unions. Foster's dispatches from the Soviet Union covered a wide variety of subjects, but he was most interested in Soviet trade unions. His articles indicated that the Soviet unions functioned in the workers' interest, helped reduce the impact of Gomper's frequent attacks on the undemocratic nature of the Russian labor movement. Foster emphasized that the fact that industrial unionism prevailed in the Soviet Union was not due to the sudden realization of a beautiful scheme. On the contrary, it is the result of the everyday experience of the movement, the culmination of a constant structural evolution to meet the needs of the workers. The Labor Herald was the official organ of the Trade Union Educational League. It was a monthly magazine that ran from March 1922 to October 1924. TUEL did not accept dues. Its main source of funding was selling subscriptions to the Labor Herald.
And with that, we'll break for our first round of questions and comments. I'd like to say one thing I noticed from that first slide, talking about the boom in the early 1920s that working people didn't face. Kind of reminds me of all these recoveries from recessions we've seen since 2008. The workers haven't seen these recoveries.
Wasn't the Red International of Trade Unions, wasn't that like kind of a dual union or something?
Not explicitly. There will be aspects of the profit turns rulings on dual unionism later on in the presentation, and we'll get into it there. But it essentially only called, or at least for the United States, only called for other unions to be formed where unions didn't already exist. and it called for the workers to still work within the AFL where they could.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback off your earlier comment that in doing research for this, it was absolutely amazing what everything the ordinary people were suffering. Whereas I remember my history college textbooks already always portrayed the 20s as the roaring times, the times of prosperity before the crash came. And then also thinking on it, I remember, oh yeah, this is when there was the flu epidemic that broke out and killed millions of people throughout the world as well, and everything else that was going on. And it's just utterly fascinating, this complete side of history that I never got growing up.
Yeah, it reminds me of an argument I got with my younger brother, who's a libertarian, who insisted that the picture of the Roaring Twenties was completely accurate, and then it listed down all the strike struggles, which were actual flat out wars, and he had no response from me, which is typical because most people don't know about those things.
It's the bore from within technique. Developed industrial unions. I feel like I don't know a whole lot about how that actually. I guess that could be a whole other class. Have like an AFL-CIO or something that I could look up for my own search.
Once again, I recommend looking at the history of the labor movement in the United States by Philip Fauna. It's a series, and you'll see a lot there. And of course, uh, American Trade Unionism by William Z. Foster and other pamphlets that he wrote.
It was the call for amalgamation to combine the craft unions of the AFL into a larger industrial union, which created them.
And was that call for a call for amalgamation? Was that why they focused on so many places in the Midwest, or was that just because, when it comes to the railroad, there's a lot of Midwestern, yards and whatnot? But I just noticed a lot of focus in Midwestern cities at that time. And yeah, why is that?
They were large industrial supply hubs in the that's where most of the activity would happen, like in Chicago.
With that, we'll go to our second round.
Section 2, the first conference of TUEL in the following period. First National Conference, Chicago, Illinois, August 26th and 27th, 1922. The June 1922 issue of the Labor Herald carried the call for the first National Conference of the TUEL, which was scheduled to open in Chicago on August 26th. For well over a year, the Chicago group had functioned as the national organization, drawing up the rules, electing the national committee, publishing the Labor Herald, auditing Secretary Treasurer Foster's books, working out the general policies to be applied in organizing and functioning as the League's directing body. Now the time had come to draw up our program and organize our forces throughout the labor movement. Representation would be based on the local general groups of the TUEL, each of which would be entitled to 6 delegates. Trade unions and central bodies could send only fraternal delegates. The proposed conference would not be held for the purpose of furthering secession movements, but to work out an organized, intensive campaign of constructive militant education in all of the industries. In the words of the call, militants, do you believe that organized labor should have a real rebel spirit? Do you believe that the craft unions should be amalgamated into industrial unions? Do you believe that the trade union movement should have new and militant leadership? If so, come to the National Conference of the Trade Union Educational League. It will be one of the most important gatherings in the history of the American labor movement. On August 26th, as scheduled, the first national conference of the TUEL got underway. The Credentials Committee reported the presence of 45 delegates from 26 towns and cities. Among them were members of the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, the Proletarian Party, anarchists, syndicalists, and trade unionists unaffiliated with any faction. According to the Labor Herald, the delegation included many of the most active and influential militants in the American trade union movement. Foster delivered the report of the National Committee. He briefly reviewed the history of dual unionism in the American labor movement and described the rise and decline of the Syndicalist League of North America and the International Trade Union Educational League. The TUEL, he acknowledged, had a very feeble early history, but this had changed after February of 1922. And at the present time, the League has groups and connections in practically all the important industrial centers of the United States and Canada. In fact, its influence in the labor movement could be measured in part by the fact that the powers that be are determined to crush it. Despite this, the TUEL was carrying on a militant campaign everywhere for the revamping of the present lackluster trade union movement into a genuine fighting organization. Foster criticized the AFL for defeating a resolution calling for industrial unionism at its 1922 convention. Even after Secretary Morrison had reported a loss of more than 700,000 members during the preceding year, wow, bringing the total membership down to less than 3,200,000. Resolutions were also adopted dealing with specific trade union issues. The National Committee was authorized to call a national amalgamation conference of the TUEL for the purpose of bringing before the American labor movement the necessity of amalgamation and to lay plans of education whereby the inevitable development may best be hastened. A resolution on political action was adopted, the first time this had occurred at a convention in which Foster played a leading role. It stressed the importance of political action by trade unions as a means of exerting pressure upon the governments of their countries in order to win them over or at least neutralize them. In the United States, however, the political movement had been thwarted and misdirected by the Gompers policy of rewarding friends and punishing enemies. The policy which hooks the labor movement as a tail onto the capitalist political kites literally poisons the trade unions. It introduces directly into their ranks all the corrupt influences of capitalist politics. Besides keeping the organization committed to the promulgation of capitalist economics, so long as it persists, the workers cannot acquire a class understanding of their class position in society, and without this, militant labor organization is impossible. The conference therefore condemned the Gompers' political policy as fatal to the success of the trade union movement and called upon the workers of America to take the necessary steps for engaging in a militant campaign of independent working class political action. The conference also announced support for the Federated Press, proposed the shop delegate form of organization and industrial amalgamation, condemned secessionism and dual unions, and approved affiliation to the RILU. Trade union members expelled from their organizations because of activities on behalf of the TUEL or for other reasons were instructed to seek readmission. The coal strike then in progress was endorsed, and sympathy and solidarity were expressed for the striking railroad shopmen. The culmination of the resolutions came with the approval of workers' control of industry, the abolition of capitalism, and the institution of a workers' commonwealth. The slogan of the League from then on was to be work, not talk. Reports of the industrial sections included plans for amalgamation in the building trades, railroads, metal trades, and needle trades. There were no delegates from the transport, food, and amusement sections. Consequently, no reports on these industries were presented. The coal miners delegation submitted a progressive program for action in the United Mine Workers of America, and William Dunn was assigned to work with the metal miners. The police had seized the reports of the boot and shoe and textile industries during their raid, so that the delegates heard only a short summary of these reports. The Constitution of the TUEL, adopted by the National Conference, stated that the League was neither a union nor a union center, but that it aimed to combine trade unionists within established organizations to achieve progressive policies. It expressly forbade the collection of anything in the nature of union dues from its members. The League was to be purely an educational body, not a trade union. Only good standing members of recognized trade unions could hold office in the League and participate in its meetings. Financially, the organization would depend on voluntary contributions from individuals and local unions, the sale of literature, and a sustaining fund. The fund was to be promoted by the sale of special sustaining fund certificates. The national officers of the League were to be a secretary-treasurer and a national committee composed of the 14 secretaries of the national industrial sections. Between national conferences, the national committee was to carry out the policies of the League. The aim of the TUEL was to carry on an intensified campaign of educational work within the trade unions to the end that the natural development of these bodies to ever more clear-sighted, cohesive, militant, and powerful organizations may be facilitated, and thus the labor movement hastened on to the accomplishment of the great task of working-class emancipation. To organize all militant trade unionists into local general educational groups, to carry on the work of amalgamation between the various crafts with the aim of eventually bringing each craft into its natural basic trade industrially. 7 distinct principles made up the program of the TUEL. 1, rejection of dual unionism. 2, rejection of the AFL's class collaboration policies and adoption of the principle of class struggle. 3, industrial unionism through amalgamation of existing unions. 4, organization of the unorganized. 5, unemployment insurance. 6, a labor party. And 7, the shop delegate system. All League members were urged to contribute at least $2 per year to the sustaining fund, which they could pay in installments. The first of which, however, had to be at least $1. Of the money to be collected, 50% would go to the National League and 50% to the local league. Every real league fighter would not only be a contributor to the fund, but would help convince all those who sympathize with the Trade Union Educational League to contribute to the sustaining fund.
Between the first and second conference, TUEL was well received and soon developed a broad left progressive coalition. Militant workers all over the country, disgusted with Gompersism, quickly became interested in its program. Among others, Alex Howat, Kansas mine leader, became a League member, and so did J.G. Brown, national head of the Labor Party, while John Fitzpatrick and Ed Nockels looked upon the organization with a friendly eye. Debs endorsed the League and wrote, quote, "The Trade Union Educational League is, in my opinion, the one rightly directed movement for the industrial unification of the American workers, unquote. TUEL quickly established flourishing local and national groups in various industries: mining, textile, building, clothing, food, leather, etc. At its National Railroad Conference in Chicago in December 1922, there were 425 delegates from all over the country. Otto Wangerin led this strong movement. The TUEL groups were also established in Canada under the general leadership of Tim Buck. Almost at once, the League began to exert a strong influence in many situations. In Chicago, two militants, Charles Crumbian, Nels Jarre, and others, were largely responsible for a union demonstration of 125,000 workers against the infamous Landis Building Trades Award. At the Detroit Convention of the Maintenance of Way Union in 1922, the aroused delegation, led by a few TUEL members, fired Grable, the union president, and his entire administration for their crass betrayal of the railroad shopman strike. In the current Machinist Union national election, the left-wing nominee for general president, the TUEL candidate, polled 14,598 votes against 41,837 votes for the incumbent, William H. Johnston. Andrew Overgaard led this movement. In the needle trades, the left wing at once became an important factor. In the National Coal Strike of 1922, League militants, by calling huge protest meetings of miners, prevented Frank Farrington, the Illinois District UMWA leader, from making a separate settlement that would have broken the strike. At the UMWA convention of that year, the League members, working jointly with Alex Howat on the question of the latter's expulsion because of his all-out fight against the infamous Kansas Industrial Court Law, polled a majority of convention votes against John L. Lewis. Early in 1923, Joseph Manley and Margaret Cowell were instrumental in preventing a split of some 50,000 foreign-born workers from the UMWA throughout the Pennsylvania anthracite regions. And keep that 50,000 number in mind. This secession movement was provoked when the conservative district leadership suddenly decided to change the union organization from a language to a mind basis, the purpose of which was to throw the union's control into the hands of conservative English-speaking elements. Pat Toohey and Tom Myerscough were the League's outstanding leaders among the miners. League members were especially active in the 1922 National Railroad Shopman strike. While on a national tour to strengthen the strike, Foster, the secretary-treasurer of TUEL, was kidnapped from a hotel in Denver by the Colorado Rangers, the state police. Held several days, spirited all the way across Colorado and Wyoming, and dumped out at the Nebraska state line. Debs wired Foster his support. This case was the central issue in that fall's elections in Colorado, with the result of that the incumbent governor was defeated and state rangers were abolished during the new governor's term. The amalgamation of the trade unions into industrial unions and the formation of a labor party and the recognition of Soviet Russia. These corresponded to the most pressing needs of the labor movement. The League concentrated its fight nationally around these three major issues. The great rank and file of organized labor, disgusted and indignant at the shameful bankruptcy of their leaders in the face of the employers' offensive, gave the three issues powerful support. Amalgamation or annihilation. Amalgamation and the Labor Party. Recognize Soviet Russia, were slogans that ran like wildfire throughout the labor movement during 1922 and 1923. The big campaign for amalgamation began with the adoption of a vote of 114 to 37 of a resolution by Johnstone and Foster at a meeting of the Chicago Federation of Labor on March 19th, 1922. At the following meeting, the reactionaries, who hoped to rescind the resolution, were again defeated, this time by 102 to 14. Alarmed at these developments, on April 11th, Gompers came to Chicago and, fearing to attend the CFFL session, called a meeting at the Morrison Hotel of several hundred hand-picked union officials, putting out the slogan, quote, "Capture the CFL from the Reds," end quote. He advocated what meant a violent attack on the local federation, but nothing came of this desperate proposal. The CFL's endorsement of amalgamation stood fast. The progressive prestige of the Chicago Federation of Labor was high because of its sponsorship of the big meat packing and steel company campaigns, its leading role in the Labor Party movement, its active support of Mooney and Billings, and its general reputation as an anti-Gompers organization, so that when it endorsed amalgamation, this had a tremendous influence nationally. Trade union organizations all over the country, wherever the party and the TUEL had contacts, began to adapt resolutions for amalgamation. The movement ran like a prairie fire, with the confused and alarmed Gompers machine unable to halt it. The rank and file saw in the amalgamation movement the labor solidarity and fighting policy so shamefully lacking in the bitter strikes of the period. The top union leadership saw in it a deadly menace to their whole corrupt position. 16 international unions during the next 18 months endorsed amalgamation, including such organizations as the railway clerks, maintenance of way workers, typographical, molders, amalgamated clothing workers, furriers, bakery, lithographers, brewery, butcher workmen, and others. 17 state federations, including Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Washington, and others, took similar action. Scores of large city central bodies and trade councils also went for amalgamation, as did thousands of local unions, 3,377 in the railway industry alone. Tim Buck also reported, quote, "Amalgamation resolutions have been endorsed during the past year by almost every kind of union in every part of Canada," unquote. The League was well within the truth when it claimed that 2 million organized workers had endorsed amalgamation, or more than half of the whole labor movement. And this is a chart from an issue of the Labor Herald of the plan for process of amalgamation. We will share this on our social media accounts. We really don't have time to leave this up and go through it. In March 1923, the TUEL put out a National Labor Party referendum directly to 35,000 local unions of the AFL and railroad brotherhoods. Although this met with active opposition from the reactionaries, 7,000 locals replied favorably to the League, and doubtless many thousands more took affirmative action without notifying the TUEL. And with that, we'll break for our second round of questions and comments. One thing I want to note, it mentioned about the AFL membership decline in 1922 from 3.2 million to 700,000. One union, it was especially bad, and it continued into the late 1920s, was the United Mine Workers of America, who, under the leadership of John L. Lewis at the time, its membership fell from 600,000 members to estimated between 60,000 and 150,000. So at its worst approximation, it lost 90% of its membership.
I found it interesting that they mentioned, I forgot in which quote, about the fact that you somehow had to get workers to understand class consciousness if you're going to be able to get a militant union member. And so that is still a problem today. And I just am curious, anybody that wants to comment on that. It's all about educating for class consciousness.
And in many ways, it's worse today, because McCarthyism absolutely gutted, and Taft-Hartley absolutely gutted the militancy of the labor movement. And with that, we'll go to our third section.
All right. So section 3, the second conference of TUEL and the following period. Second national conference took place in Chicago, Illinois, September 1st and 2nd of 1923. On September 1st, 1923, the second TUEL National Conference opened. It was attended by 103 delegates from 90 cities, including 3 from Canada and 1 from Mexico. In his introductory remarks greeting the delegates, Foster noted that in spite of a period of relative prosperity, the AFL was not gaining in membership. On the other hand, the principles of progressive trade unionism were gaining. Over 2 million trade unionists had expressed support for the principle of consolidation of the craft unions, and it was possible to state unequivocally that, quote, the rank and file of American organized labor has been won to the broad concept of industrial unionism. Nevertheless, it was still difficult to give organizational expression to the principles of progressive unionism, and the fight had to be carried to all conventions of international unions. The summary of the year's activities of the TUEL presented to the conference emphasized that, in the main, the League had fulfilled the promise of its first national conference. The reports of the various industrial groups seemed to bear this out. The building trade section announced the establishment of connections with militants in 65 large building trade centers in 19 states and 6 provinces. More than 11,000 copies of the League's amalgamation program for the industry had been distributed. Because of the boom in the industry, the militants were ready to start an intensified industrial drive. The Railroad Committee reported the successful distribution of more than 100,000 copies of its amalgamation plan. Active amalgamation committees were operating in many centers, and a lively bulletin was being published. Several district conferences had already been held by the militants in the railroad industry. The Printing Trades Committee reported that of the 6 international unions in that industry, 3 had already endorsed amalgamation. At the same time, the conference noted that, quote, the reactionary officialdom of the trade unions had launched a bitter attack against left-wing militants in the railroad, mining, and needle trades unions. And in the AFL itself, quote, it is probable that 1924 will be characterized by a more systematic war against the left wing by the reactionary officialdom. Foster insisted, however, that this must not deter the TUEL from undertaking and carrying out, quote, the greatest and most pressing task confronting the working class of America, the organization of the millions of unorganized toilers in the industries. As things stood in 1923, quote, the unions, AFL and independents together, comprise not more than 3.5 million members of a total of at least 25 million eligible to join. Organized labor controlled only the, quote, barest fringe of the working class. The rest are helpless in the grasp of the exploiters. The great steel, textile, automobile, meat packing, rubber, metal mining, lumber, and general manufacturing industries are completely unorganized or possess only the weakest and most fragmentary unions. The situation, Foster noted, presented an exceptionally favorable opportunity, quote, to accomplish this great indispensable task of organization. Labor was in big demand in all industries. The workers were, quote, in a militant mood and, if approached right, will organize readily. However, the situation also contained a danger. our prevailing prosperity is only a passing thing. It cannot last long. It was bound to be followed by one of the worst periods of depression that this or any other country has ever seen. And when the inevitable industrial breakdown came, woe betide labor if it has not had the intelligence and initiative to strengthen its lines by organizing the unorganized. The unions would be crushed. At its peril will organized labor neglect the present opportunity to organize the unorganized. Thus, the situation confronting TUEL was clear. The organization of the unorganized is the supreme problem of our times. Upon its solution depends the welfare, if not the actual life, of the whole labor movement. To achieve this objective is now the greatest task confronting the militants. The period following the election of 1924 was a difficult one for the Trade Union Educational League. Its official organ acknowledged that, quote, the League is experiencing a sharp period of isolation. That, quote, within the past 2 years, the influence of the League, in certain respects, seriously diminished in the unions. And that, quote, the movement undoubtedly lacks the broad sweep that it once had. Especially as the League largely lost leadership over the so-called progressive elements, which played such an important part in its early activities, the masses in the unions are not responding to its slogans as they once did. Between the Second and Third Congress, several critics blamed this state of affairs on the split between John Fitzpatrick, president of the Chicago Federation of Labor, and William Z. Foster, on the formation and rapid abandonment of the Federated Farmer Labor Party, and on the isolation of the League from the La Follette movement. While conceding that there was merit to this argument, Foster placed the main blame on the labor bureaucrats and said that events had proved that they were, quote, hopelessly reactionary. No matter how strong the pressure of the rank and file, he maintained, the high officials were ready to go to any lengths to crush it. Quote, under our leadership, fully half of the whole labor movement demanded amalgamation. Yet the bureaucrats ignored the demand completely. With the utmost indifference to the needs of their membership, they beat it back. Hardly a single amalgamation have they permitted to take place. Then there was the expulsion policy. Unwilling to alter their class collaboration policies and to carry out the TUEL's fighting program, they expelled all militants, communists, non-communist TUEL members, and any workers who endorsed the League's program. Small wonder, then, that it was becoming more and more difficult for the League to attract mass support. What should League members do under these circumstances? The answer, Foster insisted, was not to revert to dual unionism and split away from the, quote, old reactionary unions. Rather, the militants had to intensify building fires under the reactionary leaders. In keeping with this approach, the Trade Union Educational League presented a detailed program for building the trade unions to the 1926 AFL convention in Detroit. The document, consisting of 20 proposals, was not introduced by any delegate to the convention, since no delegate dared to acknowledge a relationship with the League for fear of immediate expulsion. Rather, it was distributed as a leaflet to the delegates as they arrived in Detroit. It was also published in the special Labor Today edition of the Daily Worker, which introduced it as one of the most significant declarations of the labor movement. In the eyes of the TUEL, the task of democratizing the AFL was crucial to the future of the labor movement. The AFL was urged to launch a drive to include within its ranks the railroad brotherhoods, the amalgamated clothing workers, and other independent unions. After this was achieved, the Executive Council should be enlarged to 45 members, representing principally mining, railroad, metal, textile, and other key and basic industries. To achieve the democratization of the AFL, an end had to come to the present system of complete control of the AFL and its component unions, AFL convention, etc., within the hands of an autocratic bureaucracy to the exclusion of rank and file participation and control. The TUEL demanded that at least 25% of the members of the Executive Council shall be actual workers, and that the representation of the various international and local bodies in the AFL convention shall consist of at least 60% of rank and file workers employed at the trades. All convention delegates should be selected by general referendum vote of their respective organizations. The convention representation of the state federations and central labor bodies should be increased from the present system of one delegate each to from 2 to 10 and 2 to 5 respectively, according to the size of these organizations. Upon the demand of 25% of the members of the Executive Council, or of 25% of the delegates at the AFL convention, or of 1,000 local unions, quote, any question, including the election of officers, shall be submitted to a general referendum vote. Since Foster had already characterized the AFL convention that had preceded the 1926 gathering as, quote, the worst ever in the history of the American Federation of Labor, and as furnishing incontrovertible proof that the, quote, bureaucrats now at the head of the trade unions are unwilling and unable to adopt a labor policy suited to the needs of the American workers. It is obvious that the TUEL had no hope of seeing any of its 20 proposals adopted. Hence, it came as a surprise that the Detroit Convention, as we have seen, unanimously adopted a resolution calling on the Federation to initiate an organizing drive among automobile workers. Even though the TUEL knew that the delegates supported the resolution out of fear that the communist-led independent auto workers union might succeed in organizing these workers if the AFL did not, the convention's action was hailed by the TUEL, which offered to cooperate in the organizing campaign. The AFL rejected the offer and soon demonstrated, as noted above, that its own organizing campaign in auto was little more than a paper resolution. Among other factors, the rivalry among the 18 international unions that claimed jurisdiction in the automobile industry prevented concerted action. The AFL fiasco in auto intensified the criticism of the Federation by the TUEL. William F. Dunn accused the Federation of surrender and conscious reaction. Foster charged that the leadership had gone completely over to class collaboration and was concerned only with the protection of their group interests as a bureaucracy. While most continued to oppose dual unionism and to favor working inside the existing unions, others felt that the policy of building fires under the reactionary leaders had produced little in the way of organizing the unorganized. In the main, however, the formation of new unions was branded as dual unionism and as constituting a disruptive influence in the labor movement. In their work among the textile workers in Passac, New Jersey in 1926, TUEL had at first operated independently, but had later agreed to abandon independent unionism and to enter the AFL United Textile Workers. Apart from the Auto Workers Union, little effort was made to organize the unorganized independently. Meanwhile, thousands of militants were expelled from the existing unions and left without any labor organization in which to operate. This is the third national conference, which took place December 3rd through the 4th, 1927. The issue of whether or not to begin work to establish new unions was debated at the Third National Conference of the Trade Union Educational League. The majority of the delegates were longtime opponents of dual unionism, and they strongly resisted any demand for the establishment of new unions. Instead, the conference directed that all efforts be concentrated towards continuing work inside the AFL, called upon the expelled workers to fight for reinstatement into their former unions. The conference put forth as a central slogan, "Save the trade unions." Fearful of dual unionism, the leaders of the TUEL hung back. It took the intervention of the Red International of Trade Unions, or Profintern, and the Communist International to change that position. On March 17th, 1928, the Fourth World Congress of the RILU opened in Moscow. Congress adopted a program committing the left wing of the trade union movement to the establishment of new unions in those industries where none existed and where current organizations barred effective alliances with other left-wing groups. The resolution referred specifically to the TUEL, stating, quote, "The vital and immediate task of the TUEL is to become the leading organization struggling to organize the unorganized, concentrating especially in mining, steel, oil, automobiles, rubber, textile, chemicals, marine, transport, and lumber industries. The TUEL, when necessary, may fight for the affiliation of the organizations of the AFL, but only on conditions which guarantee class leadership and a militant program." While the resolution emphasized the need to build new unions in the United States and made the organization of the unorganized the central TUEL task, it also noted that the necessity of developing work in the AFL, quote, "At the same time, it must use all the possibilities of working inside the existing unions and fighting for the leadership of the workers organized in them."
And with that, we'll break for our third round of questions and comments.
I'm really struck how just what a time that decade must have been with people trying to figure out, okay, how do we organize workers in our trades and our workplaces, and then how do we go about just building a union itself, and then what's all the other steps and things we got to do and considerations. Just it's amazing.
All right. If there's no more hands up, we're going to go right to our fourth section and final section.
Fourth conference, the formation of the TUEL. The fourth national conference of the TUEL was held in Cleveland from August 21st to September 1st, 1929. The TUEL had agitated for the organization of the unorganized, for amalgamation of the craft unions into industrial unions, and for a labor party. In general, it had opposed dual unionism, placing its major emphasis on work within the existing unions. At this conference, the TUEL was reorganized as the Trade Union Unity League. This marked a shift toward the organization of the unorganized into independent industrial unions. At the same time, it aimed to continue organizational work within what it called the reformist unions. William Z. Foster, who was General Secretary of the Trade Union Educational League, was elected to the same position of the Trade Union Unity League. The formation of the TUEL. 3 new unions had already been established by the TUEL in industries where it had its most substantial forces, and where, because of the wholesale expulsion of the militants, the opportunity to continue work inside the union for the organization of the unorganized against class collaboration policies and for other progressive trade union programs had all but vanished. These were the National Miners Union, the National Textile Workers Union, and the Needle Trades Workers Industrial Union. 690 delegates from 18 states attended the Cleveland Conference. Of these, 322 came from the 3 new industrial unions and were said to represent about 57,000 members, admittedly an excessive estimate. 159 delegates came from left-wing groups within trade unions, 107 from small groups in unorganized industries, 18 from AFL locals, 40 were members of the TUEL National Committee, and 44 were fraternal delegates. 62 delegates were Black, and there were 72 women and 159 youths. The delegates were predominantly from the basic industries of the country. A special effort had been made to have a large Black delegation in Cleveland. Notable Black TUEL leaders, Henry C. Rosemond, Vice President of the Needle Trades Workers Industrial Union, stated, "I wish to urge all Black workers of my trade, as well as all Black workers in other trades, to support the coming Trade Union Unity Convention being held in Cleveland. This convention will embrace many angles of the Black workers' problem here in the United States, which the AFL has never touched, since it is part of the terrific and miserable conditions and oppressions that the Black workers are suffering. The Cleveland Convention will be the first step toward the establishment of real trade union unity in the United States, securing complete political, social, and economic equality controlled by the workers for the benefit of the workers." Two women, Rose Wardis of the Needle Trades Workers Industrial Union, and Anne Burlack, a young organizer for the National Textile Workers Union, were elected to the TUEL's National Committee. A women's conference was held in connection with the Cleveland Convention, at which women from the needle trades, textile, mining, electrical, auto, and other industries described the problems facing working women and pointed out that one of the major tasks of the TUEL would be to organize 8,500,000 women workers, still practically unorganized. The Women's Conference was chaired by Mary Voice, a Black representative of a ladies' auxiliary of the National Miners Union, and one of 7 delegates from the miners' auxiliaries. The Constitution and Program of TUEL. Much of the time spent at the Cleveland Convention was utilized for the discussion and adoption of the Constitution and Program of the Trade Union Unity League. Article 2 of the Constitution on TUEL membership read, "The Trade Union Unity League shall include as members all wage workers and their labor organizations in industry and agriculture, regardless of race, creed, color, sex, age, or craft, who accept its program of class struggle." Although it was operating as a new trade union center, the Trade Union Unity League declared itself against a policy of blanket withdrawals from the AFL without regard to the situation in the existing union. It proposed to form new unions only where the AFL unions were either decrepit or non-existent. It declared in its program, "The new Trade Union Unity League has as its main task the organization of the unorganized into industrial unions independent of the AFL. At the same time, it organizes the workers within the reformist unions. It unites politically and organizationally the unemployed with the employed." The Constitution provided for 3 types of national organizations: 1, industrial unions, 2, industrial leagues, and 3, trade union minority groups. 1, the national industrial unions were based upon the principle of one shop, one industry, one union. They were departmentalized according to the important subdivisions of their industries. They had autonomy in electing their own officials, in setting their dues rates and initiation fees, and working out their programs and union agreements, and in conducting their own strikes, subject only to general TUEL control. The industrial unions of the TUEL were to stand uncompromisingly for the organization of all sections of the working class, especially exploited Negroes, for the woman, the youth, the unskilled, as well as the skilled, the foreign-born worker, side by side with the native worker. 2. The National Industrial Leagues were industrial unions in embryo. They were loose national groupings of local unions, shop committees, and individual workers. Since they were not strong enough to function as unions, their dues were set and their general activities supervised by the TUEL Executive Board. 3. The National Trade Union minority groups represented a continuation of the former TUEL national industrial sections working within the conservative unions. Where AFL and TUEL unions existed in the same industry, the TUEL union was to be connected with the TUEL minority and the AFL union to secure joint action. Unlike the AFL and the Railroad Brotherhoods, the new Union Center would organize all sections of the working class: Black workers, women, youth, skilled, unskilled, native, foreign. This would especially apply to Black workers. The Trade Union Unity League demands the fullest participation and leadership of the Black workers in all the organizations and movements of the working class. The TUEL will organize Black workers into the new industrial unions with the white workers on the basis of the fullest equality. In the old unions, it will combat all discriminatory practices aimed against Black workers. It demands admission of Black workers into these unions, and where this admittance cannot be accomplished, and where there are still no new industrial unions, it will organize separate unions for Black workers. The organization of women workers also received special attention. The TUEL program declared, with the simplification and mechanization of the industrial process, women are being brought into the industries in huge and increasing numbers. They are subjected to the fiercest speed up and compelled to work for wages 25% to 40% lower than male workers at similar occupations. The trade union leaders have altogether failed to defend the interests of the women workers, barring them from the unions and discriminating against them in an industry as they have done against the youth, the Negroes, and the foreign-born. The TUEL would, it pledged, work to unite the women workers for a joint struggle with the workers generally. It would demand for them equal pay for equal work, the general raising of women workers' wages, the establishment of a 7-hour day and 5-day week, with a 6-hour day for harmful and strenuous occupations, and a full month holiday annually with full pay. The elimination of night work in overtime, end of work in harmful occupations, protection during childbirth periods, installation of proper sanitary regulations, protection by social insurance against unemployment, old age, sickness, etc. The winning of the women workers for the class struggle was to be a major objective of the TUEL.
And with that, we'll break for our last round of questions and comments. Heavy topic tonight.
I noticed in that last slide, it talked about removing overtime, which I feel like if that was introduced today, it'd be kind of a contentious issue. Was there a lot of, I guess, discussion or disagreement on that issue back then as well? Or was it seen differently?
I mean, the goal earlier in the trade union movement was to reduce the working hours, 8 hours work, 8 hours rest, 8 hours for what we will. The goal should always be when cutting that time. And I don't have enough. Well, a lot of this in this last slide was for women workers specifically. But the goal should always be to work as little hours as possible for as much pay as possible. And I don't see how that could be contentious.
I just wanted to say that I found it fascinating that they said it was 25 to 40% lower wages for women and, other discriminatory practices. And we're still fighting for that. It's maybe not quite as bad, maybe, but still pretty bad. So very interesting, but crazy.
Thank you.
So, I actually wanted to bring something up that was in like a similar vein to this. In college, they made us read this article that essentially boiled down to the reason why there aren't as many women in the upper rungs of like employment, like CEOs, stuff like that, is because they're not confident enough. And that made me really mad. I typed a whole essay to my professor about that and told him why I thought that was, pardon my French, but bullshit. That after years and years of discrimination, you know, confidence isn't something that's easy to win back when there's statistics that show that women are constantly treated differently just because they're being women. They're treated as if they're incompetent. So I think a lot of those attitudes that led to the things that were talked about in that last slide are still pervasive in the workforce today. And we take a lot of those protections and stuff for granted, you know. I don't think that we, you know, like it's one of those things that we don't think about, but the capitalists would definitely have pregnant women out on the floor 9 months pregnant working if they could do that. So, you know, have you back in the day after you give birth if they could, you know.
Yeah, just really quick, I wanted to point out that overtime as well, what was thought of it back then is not what we think of it today, where you get 1.5 times pay. And usually it's something the employers don't want to give because that means they're paying you more money, probably more or less doing the exact same work. Whereas overtime back then is, well, we'll maybe give you like a cent or 2 cents more, and you're working now another 8-hour shift. So, just a little context.
And once again, the Harry Bridges School of Labor is presented by the Labor United Educational League, and you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. You can also find us at our website, at LUUL.us, and our publication Labor Today at labortoday.luul.us. Next month's session on the Harry Bridges School of Labor will take place on Wednesday, October 2nd at 9 p.m. Eastern, and repeated on Saturday, October 5th at 7 p.m. Eastern. And next month's session will be on the history of the World Federation of Trade Unions. But thanks to everybody for joining us tonight. Good night, everybody.